The summer heat hung thick over the Mississippi Delta in 1847, pressing down on the grand plantations like a suffocating shroud. But it wasn't the oppressive humidity that made the wealthy families of Natchez whisper behind their silk fans. It was the silence, the deafening silence about the daughters who had simply vanished. 4 years earlier, in the spring of 1843, 17-year-old Margaret Beaumont had disappeared from her family's estate. One morning she was there, picking flowers in her mother's garden. By evening her bed was empty, her clothes untouched. The Beaumonts told their neighbors she had been sent north to study with distant relatives. A lie wrapped in silk and delivered with practiced smiles. 6 months later, Sarah Whitmore vanished. Then came Elizabeth Hartwell in 1845. By 1847, when young Catherine Kellerman disappeared, the pattern should have been impossible to ignore. But in the genteel world of Mississippi high society, certain questions were never asked. Certain doors remained firmly closed. The truth began to unravel on a rain-soaked October morning in 1863, nearly 2 decades after the first disappearance. Union soldiers searching the abandoned Kellerman plantation discovered something that would shake the foundations of everything the community thought they knew. Hidden beneath rotting floorboards in what had once been the overseer's quarters, they found a leather-bound diary. Its pages, yellowed with age and stained with what looked disturbingly like tears, contained the desperate scrawls of a young woman's handwriting. "They think we are broken," read one entry, dated July 15, 1847. "They think we need to be fixed, but we are not the ones who are sick." The diary belonged to Catherine Kellerman, the last of the missing daughters. As investigators pieced together her words, a horrifying picture emerged. These weren't runaways seeking freedom or adventure. These were victims of something far more sinister. Something that had been happening right under the noses of Natchez's most respected families. The entries spoke of isolation, of shame, of young women torn from their lives and hidden away like shameful secrets. But Catherine's words revealed something else too, a network of complicity that reached into the highest levels of society. Mothers who knew. Fathers who looked the away. Community leaders who asked no questions because they already knew the answers. "The men come at dawn," Catherine had written. "Mother watches from the window, her face like stone. She says this is for my own good. She says I am sick, that I need to be cured. But I know the truth now. The sickness isn't in me. It's in all of them." As the wind whistled through the broken shutters of the abandoned plantation houses, carrying with it the weight of decades-old secrets, one thing became clear. The disappearances hadn't been questioned because they were never meant to be discovered. The daughters of Natchez's elite hadn't vanished by accident. They had been erased. And in the suffocating world of 1840s Mississippi society, where reputation mattered more than truth and appearances could kill, someone had made sure they stayed that way. But Catherine Kellerman's diary would change everything, revealing a web of darkness that stretched far deeper than anyone could have imagined. The name Kellerman carried weight in Natchez society, and Lucinda Kellerman wore that weight like a crown of thorns. Standing on the wraparound porch of Kellerman Hall, her estate sprawled across 300 acres of prime Mississippi cottonland. She was the picture of Southern aristocracy. Perfectly coiffed dark hair, never a thread out of place, never a crack in her porcelain smile. But beneath that flawless exterior lurked something far more dangerous than the snakes that slithered through her cotton fields. Lucinda had married into the Kellerman fortune at 19, bringing with her an obsession that would consume her life and destroy her daughters. Perfection. Not just in appearance, but in every aspect of existence. Her parlor showcased this mania. Crystal that caught light just so. Flowers arranged with mathematical precision. Not a single dust mote daring to settle on her imported furniture. Visitors often remarked how everything seemed frozen in time, like a museum display of the perfect life. But perfection, as Lucinda discovered, was fragile. And her daughter Catherine threatened to shatter it completely. Catherine Kellerman had inherited her father's kind eyes and gentle spirit, traits that Lucinda viewed as weaknesses to be corrected. While other plantation daughters learned embroidery and piano, Catherine preferred reading philosophy and writing in her journal. She asked uncomfortable questions about the slaves, questioned the very foundations of their world. Worse still, she had begun attracting the attention of young men whose intentions Lucinda deemed impure, threatening the pristine reputation she had cultivated so carefully. "A lady's virtue is like a mirror," Lucinda would say, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Once cracked, it can never truly be whole again." She spoke these words often, especially when watching Catherine through her bedroom window, cataloging every perceived flaw, every deviation from the impossible standard she demanded. The breaking point came in the spring of 1847. Catherine, now 18, had been seen walking unchaperoned with Thomas Morrison, the banker's son. Neighbors had whispered. Tongues had wagged. In Lucinda's world, whispers were worse than screams. They lingered, they spread. They poisoned everything they touched. That night, behind closed doors in the Kellerman study, Lucinda met with Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, a man whose medical credentials were as questionable as his methods were cruel. He specialized in treating what he called female hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for any woman who dared step outside society's rigid boundaries. His treatments, he promised, could cure everything from inappropriate desires to rebellious thoughts. "The girl needs correction," Lucinda explained, her voice steady as a judge pronouncing sentence. "She has tendencies, unnatural inclinations toward independence that must be addressed before they corrupt her completely." Dr. Blackwood nodded knowingly. He had heard this before from other mothers in the county, mothers who loved their reputations more than their daughters. His solution was always the same: isolation, intimidation, and a special facility he operated discreetly on the outskirts of several plantations. A place where troublesome daughters could be cured away from prying eyes. "There's a barn on the Whitmore property," he explained, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Modified for medical purposes, private, secure. Your daughter would receive the most intensive care available." Lucinda felt something like relief wash over her. Finally, a solution to her Catherine problem, a way to preserve the family name while addressing her daughter's concerning behavior. She never asked about the other girls who had received this treatment. She never wondered why they never returned home. In her mind, she was saving Catherine from herself, protecting the family from scandal. But as she signed the papers authorizing her daughter's treatment, Lucinda Kellerman crossed a line from which there would be no return. She had chosen her reputation over her child's life, her social standing over her daughter's soul. 3 days later, Catherine would disappear from her bedroom in the middle of the night, beginning a nightmare that would haunt the Mississippi Delta for decades to come. And somewhere in the darkness of her obsession, Lucinda convinced herself she was doing it all out of love. The old Whitmore tobacco barn sat like a festering wound on the landscape, its weathered wood blackened by decades of Mississippi storms. But by 1847, tobacco no longer cured within its walls. Dr. Blackwood had transformed it into something far more sinister, a prison disguised as a medical facility, where the inconvenient daughters of the wealthy disappeared to be reformed. Catherine awakened in darkness so complete she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. The air was thick with the smell of rotting wood and something else, something metallic that made her stomach turn. Her wrists were raw from rope burns, and when she tried to move, chains rattled against the wooden floor. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a Mississippi flood, swift and merciless. She was not alone. 3 men controlled her world now, each playing their designated role in what Dr. Blackwood called the cure. Joshua Crane, barely 22 with calloused hands and eyes that still held traces of humanity, served as her primary guard. Samuel Fletcher, older and harder, maintained the records, documenting every aspect of her treatment with clinical detachment. And Daniel Webb, whose weathered face suggested he'd seen too much of the world's cruelty, operated as the enforcer, the one who delivered punishment when Catherine failed to comply. The treatment itself was a carefully orchestrated campaign of humiliation designed to break her spirit completely. Each morning at dawn, Catherine was forced to perform menial labor, scrubbing floors that were deliberately soiled again, moving heavy stones from one pile to another, working until her hands bled and her back screamed in agony. The work served no purpose except to exhaust her, to make her too tired to think, too weak to resist. "You must learn your place," Samuel would intone, his voice flat as a funeral dirge, as he recorded her daily activities in his leather-bound ledger. "Pride comes before the fall, and you, Miss Kellerman, have fallen far indeed." But it was the silence that broke her spirit most effectively. Days would pass without human conversation. Meals arrived through a slot in the wall, thin gruel and stale bread that barely sustained life. The isolation was calculated, designed to make her desperate for any human contact, even from her captors. When Joshua finally spoke to her after 2 weeks of silence, she nearly wept with gratitude. "I'm sorry," he whispered during one of the brief moments when Samuel and Daniel were elsewhere. His voice was rough with emotion he wasn't supposed to feel. "This isn't right. None of this is right." Those few words were like water in a desert. Catherine clung to them, to the recognition that someone in this nightmare still possessed a conscience. Slowly, carefully, she began to nurture that spark of humanity in Joshua. Small conversations during the changing of her chains, shared glances when the others weren't watching, a connection forming in the most unlikely of places. As weeks turned to months, Catherine began to understand the true scope of the horror. Through whispered conversations with Joshua, she learned she wasn't the first. The barn had housed other daughters: Margaret Beaumont, Sarah Whitmore, Elizabeth Hartwell. None had ever returned home. When she asked what happened to them, Joshua's face went pale as Mississippi cotton, and he couldn't meet her eyes. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered," he said, but his voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. The work grew harder, the conditions worse. Catherine's hands, once soft as rose petals, became raw and scarred. Her body, once the pride of Natchez society, grew thin and angular. But something unexpected happened in the depths of that manufactured hell. She found a strength she never knew she possessed. Not the artificial strength of social propriety, but something real and unbreakable. And in Joshua, she found an unlikely ally. His guilt over his role in her suffering had transformed into something deeper, a determination to help her survive, and perhaps, if the opportunity arose, to help her escape. But in the suffocating world of the barn, where every move was watched and every word recorded, hope felt as fragile as morning mist over the Mississippi. Still, as Catherine lay on her straw mattress each night, listening to the wind whistle through the barn's broken boards, she held on to that hope like a lifeline, because she had learned something important in her months of captivity. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. The terrible truth revealed itself in fragments, like shattered glass catching moonlight. Catherine wasn't an isolated case. She was part of a network of horror that stretched across multiple plantations, a conspiracy of silence that had claimed dozens of young women over the years. The barn where she suffered was just one link in a chain of facilities that existed in the shadows of Mississippi's most respectable estates. Through Joshua's reluctant revelations, Catherine learned about the others. Margaret Beaumont had been the first to arrive at this particular barn in 1843, her crime being an inappropriate attachment to one of her father's business associates. She had lasted 8 months before the isolation and labor broke her completely. Sarah Whitmore followed, guilty of reading abolitionist literature and expressing sympathy for the enslaved. Her stay was shorter, 6 months before she simply stopped eating, stopped fighting, stopped existing in any meaningful way. Elizabeth Hartwell had been different. She had fought back, had refused to submit to the treatment. Her defiance had earned her harsher punishments, longer periods of isolation until something inside her finally snapped. Joshua couldn't bring himself to describe what Elizabeth had become by the end, but the fear in his eyes told Catherine everything she needed to know. "They're not trying to cure you," Joshua whispered one night as he changed her shackles. "They're trying to erase you, to make you into something empty, something that can be sent back home without causing any more trouble." The network, Catherine learned, was Dr. Blackwood's innovation. He had convinced wealthy families across 3 counties that their problematic daughters could be reformed through his specialized treatment. The girls would disappear for months, sometimes years, and when they returned, if they returned, they were hollow shells of their former selves. Perfectly compliant, perfectly broken, perfectly silent about their experiences. Other plantations had their own facilities. The Morrison estate had converted their old slave quarters into a treatment center. The Patterson family used an abandoned overseer's house deep in their cypress swamp. Each location was isolated, secured, and operated with the same cruel efficiency, and each was staffed by men like Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel, men who had been carefully selected for their ability to follow orders without asking questions. But Samuel's meticulous record-keeping revealed something else, something that made Catherine's blood run cold. The network was expanding. Dr. Blackwood wasn't content with treating daughters who stepped out of line. He was actively encouraging families to bring their girls for preventative treatment. Young women who showed any sign of independence, intelligence, or curiosity were being labeled as potential problems requiring intervention. "It's becoming fashionable," Samuel had written in one of his reports. "The ladies of society speak of it as they would discuss a new dressmaker or milliner, a necessary service for maintaining proper order in the household." The most chilling discovery came from Daniel's careless words during one of his drinking sessions. There were other networks in other states, facilities in Alabama, Georgia, even as far north as Kentucky. Dr. Blackwood's methods were being replicated, his philosophy spreading like a disease through the upper echelons of Southern society. "It's not just about the girls anymore," Daniel had slurred, whiskey making him talkative. "It's about control, about keeping the natural order. Can't have women getting ideas above their station." Catherine realized she was witnessing something far more sinister than individual family crises. This was systematic oppression disguised as medical treatment, a coordinated effort to crush any woman who dared to think or act independently. The barn where she suffered was part of a machine designed to maintain male dominance by breaking female spirits so thoroughly that resistance became unthinkable. As she lay in her chains that night, Catherine felt the weight of all those vanished daughters pressing down on her. Margaret, Sarah, Elizabeth, they had become cautionary tales, examples of what happened to women who refused to conform. But their stories also ignited something fierce and unbreakable within her. She would not become their fate. She would not disappear into the darkness of broken compliance. Somehow, some way, she would survive this nightmare and expose the truth about what was happening in the shadows of Mississippi's Grand Estates. 6 months into her captivity, Catherine discovered something that would change everything. She was carrying Joshua's child. The realization came like a thunderbolt on a clear day, undeniable and terrifying. In the suffocating darkness of the barn, where hope was rationed like water in a drought, this pregnancy represented both her greatest vulnerability and her strongest motivation to escape. The relationship between Catherine and Joshua had evolved slowly, carefully, like flowers growing through concrete. What began as whispered words of comfort had deepened into something neither of them had expected, love blooming in the most unlikely soil. Joshua's guilt over his role in her suffering had transformed into fierce protectiveness, while Catherine's desperate need for human connection had found its answer in his gentle touch and tortured conscience. Their intimate moments were stolen fragments of tenderness in an ocean of cruelty. A hand held in darkness, lips meeting in silence, bodies finding solace in each other while the world around them practiced systematic brutality. It was wrong by every standard of their society, yet it felt like the only right thing in a world gone mad. When Catherine whispered her condition to Joshua during one of their secret encounters, she watched his face cycle through shock, terror, and finally fierce determination. A child changed everything. Dr. Blackwood's treatment for pregnant women was swift and brutal, forced procedures that eliminated both the pregnancy and often the woman herself. They had perhaps weeks before her condition became obvious, before the choice was taken from them forever. "We have to run," Joshua said, his voice barely audible above the night sounds of the Mississippi wilderness. "I won't let them hurt you or the baby." But escaping wasn't simply a matter of unlocking chains and running into the night. The network that imprisoned Catherine was too well established, too well connected. They needed help from someone with access to resources, someone who understood how the system worked from the inside. That someone turned out to be Samuel Fletcher. The discovery that Samuel was documenting everything not just for Dr. Blackwood's records, but for his own protection came as a shock. Hidden beneath his official ledgers, Samuel kept detailed accounts of the network's operations. Names, dates, locations, methods. Everything that would be needed to expose the conspiracy if the need ever arose. "I've seen too much," Samuel confessed to Joshua one night when Daniel was away. "I know what happens to men who know too much about powerful people's secrets. These records are my insurance policy." Samuel's revelation opened a door Catherine hadn't known existed. He had been keeping meticulous documentation precisely because he feared for his own life. The wealthy families involved in the network wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their reputations. Samuel's records were his guarantee of continued breathing. "But I can do more than just keep records," Samuel said, his voice heavy with years of suppressed guilt. "I can forge documents. New identities, travel papers, letters of introduction. I've been practicing for years, preparing for the day when I might need to disappear myself." The escape plan took shape slowly, carefully. Samuel would create new identities for Catherine and Joshua, husband and wife traveling north for business purposes. Daniel, whose drinking had intensified as his conscience warred with his duties, would be drugged during his evening routine, giving them a window of opportunity. A riverboat heading to St. Louis would be their passage to freedom, carrying them far from the reach of Mississippi's plantation network. But every plan has its price, and theirs would be paid in blood and sacrifice. Daniel, despite his role in the system, had begun showing signs of moral awakening. His questions about the other girls, his increasing discomfort with the treatment protocols made him a liability to the network. More importantly, his growing suspicion about Catherine's condition threatened to expose their plan before it could be executed. "Daniel won't let us leave," Joshua said, the weight of terrible knowledge in his voice. "And if he reports Catherine's pregnancy," the unspoken truth hung between them like a funeral shroud. Daniel Webb would have to die for their plan to succeed. The man who had once been their tormentor had become their greatest obstacle to freedom, and in the brutal arithmetic of survival, his life was the price of their escape. As Catherine felt the first stirrings of life within her womb, she knew that soon she would be running, not just for her own survival, but for the future of her unborn child, a child conceived in darkness but destined. She hoped for light. The Mississippi River ran black as sin under the moonless sky, its waters carrying the dreams and desperate hopes of those seeking freedom. Catherine and Joshua crept through the tall grass along the riverbank, her pregnancy now showing despite her attempts to hide it beneath loose clothing. In her arms she clutched the forged documents Samuel had created, papers that proclaimed them to be Mr. and Mrs. James Mitchell, traveling north on family business behind them. Daniel Webb's body lay cooling in the barn, a necessary sacrifice for their freedom. Joshua's hands still trembled from what he had been forced to do, but there had been no choice. Daniel's suspicions about Catherine's condition and his growing questions about their nighttime conversations had made him too dangerous to leave alive. Samuel had provided the poison, a swift-acting toxin that mimicked the effects of too much whiskey. To anyone who found him, Daniel would appear to have drunk himself to death, another casualty of a guilty conscience. The riverboat Belle Marie sat at the dock like a promise of salvation, its paddle wheel silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Steam rose from its smokestacks, and Catherine could hear the voices of early passengers preparing for the journey north. Freedom was so close she could taste it in the humid air, could feel it in the rapid beating of her heart. "Stay close," Joshua whispered, his arm protective around her shoulders. "Once we're aboard, we'll be just another couple seeking their fortune upriver." But as they approached the gangplank, Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning mist rising from the water. Something was wrong. The dock was too quiet, the shadows too still. Her instincts, honed by months of captivity, screamed warnings that her desperate heart tried to ignore. The trap revealed itself with cruel precision. As Joshua stepped onto the gangplank, Sheriff Marcus Whitmore emerged from behind a pile of cargo, his pistol drawn and pointed directly at Catherine's heart. Behind him came a figure that made Catherine's blood freeze in her veins. Her mother, Lucinda Kellerman, her face a mask of cold fury and wounded pride. "Did you really think you could escape so easily?" Lucinda's voice carried across the water like the call of a death bird. "Did you think I wouldn't discover your condition? And the man responsible for it?" Samuel Fletcher stepped into the light, his face twisted with guilt and fear. He had betrayed them, sold their freedom for his own safety. The records he had kept, the documents he had forged, all of it had been reported to Dr. Blackwood, who had immediately contacted the families involved. "I'm sorry," Samuel whispered, but his words were lost in the sound of Joshua's anguished cry as Sheriff Whitmore's deputies seized him. Catherine watched in horror as the man she loved was beaten to his knees, blood streaming from his mouth. "You corrupted my daughter," Lucinda hissed, stepping close enough that Catherine could smell her expensive perfume, mixed with the scent of her hatred. You filled her with your base desires and poisoned her mind with thoughts of rebellion. Please, Catherine begged, her hands instinctively protecting her unborn child. Please don't hurt him. This isn't his fault. Her words were cut short by Lucinda's vicious slap, the sound echoing across the water like a gunshot. You will not speak. You will not plead. You will learn what happens to daughters who shame their families. Joshua's execution was swift and brutal. Sheriff Whitmore's pistol cracked like thunder, and the man Catherine loved crumpled to the dock, his blood mixing with the river water. Her scream seemed to split the dawn sky, a sound of such anguish that even the hardened deputies looked away. But Lucinda Kellerman felt no remorse. As she watched Catherine collapse beside Joshua's body, she saw only the end of a problem that had threatened to destroy everything she had built. The pregnancy would be dealt with discreetly. The scandal would be buried with Joshua's corpse, and Catherine would be returned to a facility where she would be broken so completely that she would never again dare to dream of freedom. As the sun rose over the Mississippi, painting the water red as blood, Catherine was dragged away from the man she loved and thrust back into a nightmare that would now last forever. The letters Catherine had never seen, written in Joshua's careful hand during their time together, found their way north through channels neither of them had known existed. Samuel Fletcher, in his final act of redemption, had secretly arranged for documentation of the network's activities to be sent to abolitionists and journalists in Philadelphia and Boston. When news of Joshua's murder reached these contacts, the letters became evidence of something far larger than a single tragic love story. By the winter of 1848, investigators from the federal government arrived in Natchez under the pretense of examining tax records and property disputes. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the foundations of Mississippi society, the network of facilities, the systematic torture of young women, the conspiracy of silence among the wealthy elite. All of it came pouring out like poison from a lanced wound. Catherine, now imprisoned in a new facility deeper in the swamps, had given birth to a daughter in conditions that would have broken most women. The child, born premature and weak, had lived only 3 days before succumbing to the fever that plagued the humid prison. Catherine's grief was absolute, a darkness so complete that for weeks she couldn't speak, couldn't eat, couldn't do anything but stare at the wall where her daughter had taken her final breath. But when the federal investigators found her, something remarkable happened. The broken woman they expected to find had been forged into something harder than Mississippi steel. Catherine's testimony, delivered in a voice that carried the weight of all the vanished daughters, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. They told me I was sick, she said, her words cutting through the packed courtroom like a blade. They told me I needed to be cured of thinking, of feeling, of being human. But the sickness was never in me. It was in them, in a system that would rather break its daughters than allow them to live as God intended. The trial of Lucinda Kellerman and Dr. Cornelius Blackwood became a sensation that reached far beyond Mississippi's borders. Northern newspapers carried daily accounts of the testimony, while Southern papers tried desperately to downplay the scandal. But the evidence was overwhelming. Samuel Fletcher's meticulous records, the physical evidence from multiple facilities, the testimony of survivors who had been thought lost forever. When the guilty verdicts were read, Lucinda Kellerman showed no emotion. She had maintained throughout the trial that she had been trying to save her daughter from herself, that everything she had done was motivated by love and social responsibility. Even as she was sentenced to life in prison, she held her head high, convinced that history would vindicate her actions. Dr. Blackwood received the death penalty, though he would die of pneumonia in prison before the sentence could be carried out. The other families involved faced varying degrees of justice. Some fled to Europe, others retreated to remote estates, and a few actually expressed remorse for their participation in the network. The Kellerman plantation was sold to pay legal fees and victim compensation. The new owners, a family from Ohio with abolitionist sympathies, immediately freed all enslaved persons and converted the property into a school for freed slaves and poor whites alike. The barn where Catherine had suffered was torn down board by board, and in its foundation, workers discovered the bones of at least 6 young women, the final evidence of the network's true scope. Catherine survived the trial, but survival isn't the same as healing. She moved north to Massachusetts, where she spent her remaining years advocating for legal protections for women and children. She never married again, never had another child, but her testimony helped establish precedents that would protect future generations of women from similar horrors. When she died in 1891, her obituary in the Boston Herald called her a voice for the voiceless, a light in the darkness of human cruelty. But perhaps the most fitting memorial came from an unexpected source. The barn's foundation had been turned into a small garden where wildflowers now grew freely, untended and uncontrolled, reaching toward the sun with the kind of desperate beauty that can only come from surviving the darkest nights. The secrets of Mississippi's macabre families had finally been dragged into the light, but their shadows would linger for generations to come.